In this session, captured live from GetGlobal in Los Angeles, Andy Kaplan, president of Sony Pictures Television Networks, will be interviewed by Ken Silverman, head of North America at Sannam S4. Here, Andy Kaplan addresses Sony's global television strategies and impact, as well as where the international television field could be headed over the next decade. He will also detail Sony Networks' business in India, which for over 20 years has operated several of the most popular channels in the highly lucrative and rapidly growing Indian television market.
Good morning. Welcome to what promises to be a fascinating, very informative, and very enjoyable session. A window into a preeminent global television empire and a collection of worldwide networks now reaching more than 2 billion subscribers around the globe. It's also a rare opportunity to hear from a true giant in the global television space, Andy Kaplan, president of Sony Pictures Television, whose portfolio includes over 100 channels in more than 175 countries. Among Andy's most notable accomplishments is recognizing early the great promise of India and television. What he saw and what he and his associates have done there has now made Sony the dominant international television player in the India market space and a gem within the Sony Pictures entire Sony Pictures Corporation. As mentioned, my name is Ken Silverman. I've been involved in U.S. and international media for 40 plus years and specifically engaged within this space in India for more than 20 years. I'm currently head of North America for Sannam S4 Group with 140 people on the ground and 5 offices across India. We are the leading global organization bringing international companies, universities, and nonprofits into India and setting them up in business. And now, before I bring Andy on stage, we'll take 2 minutes to run a video that will literally show you Andy Kaplan's world. Please run the video.
At Sony, we combine artistry with innovation to create amazing human experiences that move you. Powered by Sony, Sony Pictures Television Networks delivers a true global impact, reaching billions of subscribers through powerhouse brands and premium entertainment that moves. Experiences that move billions, united by the power of Sony in new ways every day, like only we can. That's the power to move. Sony Pictures Television Networks. The power to move.
Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Andy Kaplan. Thank you all for being here this morning. Andy and I have done this before, so let me jump in and ask you my traditional first question, which is, how did you get into the business? How your early years, college, what brought you into media?
The traditional first question. Grew up in Los Angeles, which is, for the most part, an industry town, and so I guess had the entertainment bug. Didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, so I didn't have a path, but I knew I wanted to do something in it. I went to UCLA. I got a degree in economics, which didn't have much to do with wanting to be in the entertainment business, I suppose. And I got a job in the mailroom at Embassy Television, which was Norman Lear and Jerry Parenchio's company. And I suppose that's where if I had the bug before, that's where I sort of solidified it. And then I just sort of had I got a job out of the mailroom sort of as a junior salesman account executive, and I just sort of worked my way up the ladder ever since in a non-traditional, completely unplanned path.
And so jumping into Sony, describe Sony Pictures Television when you first showed up, and then what is it today?
Sure. Well, it's a little bit like, what was the television business there? I won't go all the way back to when we had just 3 networks, because actually around this period when I first started, the Fox network was starting up, so it was the 4th network. So you had ABC, CBS, and NBC, and then Fox was coming on. We were one of the first production companies to do pilots and shows for them, and one of the first shows that came on their network, which was ours, was Married with Children, sure. Which, that plus The Simpsons sort of really made it. But what television was just these networks. There were some local television stations, and so you'd get local news and some syndicated program and so forth. But it was a much simpler time. It was a time where if you were a student of the business, I could, and I knew a lot of people who could actually tell you by memory the schedule, at least the primetime schedule of sure. the four networks. You knew it was, All in the Family and Mary Tyler Moore were on Saturday night. You could do all that. I would defy anybody now to be able to not only list off the schedule of 500 networks, but even know the schedules at all, because nobody watches scheduled programming. Yep. It's all on demand. So I think that was that's what it was then, which has changed so completely differently now. The world of syndication was sort of just starting up, and the off-network rerun right. world, which then became such an important financial aspect of the business, and the thing that not only made a lot of people a lot of money, but also ended up funding a lot of programming, was kind of in its early days. And the international world was really very nascent. All the studios had international sales divisions, but they weren't really well established. I mean, in our case, for example, it wasn't like we had offices in 15 cities around the world. We had 2 guys who got on planes and went off, and they hired agents locally and so forth, because the money that was coming out of that market was small, sure. but it was the early days. Things have changed since then.
And describe now. I mean, we saw the video, but just in a capsule.
Well, now in addition to in the United States having so many places to license or make product for, tens and tens and tens of linear channels and on-demand channels and so forth. But in addition to that, the international marketplace is frankly up where at least half, if not more than half, of the revenues against these programs comes in. And so while creatively, in a lot of ways, the U.S. is sort of still the place where it all starts and needs to happen and work, the international buyers and the money that comes from them is it's not additive. It's fundamental in the whole economic ecosystem of it all.
And so broadly speaking, Sony in Latin America, Sony in Asia, Sony in Europe, what's your profile like?
Well, for the business that I oversee in particular, which is the channel business, we have a number of linear channels in each market, a little bit different in each places, but the main brands which we push out around the world are either a Sony channel or AXN, which is an action channel. They're both sort of general entertainment channels that are based on U.S. primetime programming. So whether it's programming that Sony makes for the networks here and then we broadcast internationally, or we also broadcast content from all of the other studios. They're, in a lot of places, they're pay TV channels, so they're not necessarily penetrated 100% throughout a market, but they'll be on cable and satellite systems. And in some cases, we actually do have free TV over-the-air broadcasting stations. And those are sort of two of the US-based product ones, but additionally, we have a big Japanese anime presence by virtue of the fact that we're a Japanese company and that is such an important programming profile in Japan, which we push out around the world. We have some Korean programming channels, we have some other Asian programming channels, and then of course in India, we have, which is our biggest business, We have something like 25 channels there, but many of them, or most of them, are all local programming-based, Hindi language-based programming, and so that's like a whole different kind of profile.
And so before we get into India, which we'll do next, talk a little bit about the profile and status of Sony Pictures Television within this gigantic multinational Japanese electronics company.
Well, the Sony Corp has a lot of different operating units in lots of different fields. Of course, they're best known even to this day for their consumer electronics and manufacturing televisions. They make handsets. They have a huge life insurance and financial services company in Japan. They're in the medical devices business. They're the market leader in digital image sensors. The music company is one of the two biggest in the world. Sony Pictures is one of 6 major studios. And then, of course, the PlayStation business, which is probably the fastest growing business within the Sony Corporation, is one of, I guess, 3 console platform businesses, but a really important big business. So it's a diversified portfolio of products within the Sony Corporation, and one of the important sort of I guess pillars of it all is entertainment. With entertainment is Sony Pictures, which includes movies and television and our media networks business, and then the music business, and then the PlayStation to a degree.
What's interesting too is that other Japanese multinational consumer and electronics companies, British companies, German companies, there have been so many companies that have come into the U.S. entertainment industry, in a lot of cases, burn their toes, burn their fingers, and left. But Sony, how many years now is Sony?
It's 27 years.
27 years.
Yeah.
That in itself is a remarkable success story.
I think Matsushita came and right. owned Universal for a short period of time. But in terms of ownership, there haven't been that many international companies, but where they've come and burned their toes, as you put it, is in financing. Yeah. Financing the movie business, and we've seen over the years, we've seen it from everywhere from Canada to Germany to the Netherlands to China to and so forth. And it's some have had more success than others. It's a tough business. It's a long game. You got to play a long game, and anybody who kind of comes in and tries to time the market, I think, usually has a problem.
Yeah, I was thinking Matsushita. So let's talk India. What was the television landscape like in India 20 years ago when Sony entered the market?
Well, I think what was happening in that part of the world was that a lot of companies like ours were trying to figure out how to take advantage of what even then were large populations, and the pretty girl was China, even back then 20 years, and everybody was trying to figure out how to play China. And I always say when they were all going left, we turned right, but I guess it depends which way you're going. But the problem with China then and now was a very restrictive regulatory environment. You couldn't own a majority of a channel, and you couldn't import an international brand. That's why Disney doesn't have, even today with all the money they've invested there in theme parks and all that sort of stuff. Nickelodeon was trying to get in, and it's just part of their regime. Now, from a local production business, it's been a lot easier to do things, and we've been there for a long time, producing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of local production, and we license a lot of content into China. But from the channel business standpoint, it was too restrictive. But as I said, a lot of the multinationals were trying to crack that code and spent a lot of time investing in relationships and knowing the right people and seeing if they could figure it out. We went the other way. We went to India, probably a little bit smart, a little bit strategic, and a whole lot of lucky. Then you had to have a local partner to start a channel. So we found a group of local entrepreneurs that owned a movie library, and we started it up 20 years ago. It was very, very much the Wild West. It was very, very unregulated. It was very early days. Satellite technology had just gone gone up in the air. And so it wasn't that hard and it wasn't that expensive to put a signal up and get it down to, you know, what at the time there, it's come a long way, but was literally households with wires strung across, you know, fences from one to the other with pirated boxes, and you know, it was all just it was primitive, it was illegal, and it was early stages. But we started it up, and we got traction early on. Now, we weren't the first to do it. There were really three players. There was us, a local entrepreneur named Subhash Chandra, and Z, which was and still is the largest owned really local group, and Fox was there at the same time. We were under the Star brand, and so. But I think that, and so we rode a wave. We rode a technological wave. We rode a wave of an audience. If today there's 1.2 billion people there, I'm going to say there were 700 million. I don't know what the exact number was. Whatever it was still quantums more than any other TV populations or just household populations you were going to see anywhere in the world, with the exception of China. And so the sheer momentum of the math was compelling, even though there wasn't a very large economic base, because there was, you know, a lot of low income people, but even by virtue of the hundreds of millions of people, you could just sort of see where the trends were going to go, and that's been very right over the last 20 years, and we see projected to continue on faster than most other territories going forward. And I think what's really important and has been beneficial for us, being one of the first in and having an early mover advantage, is it's now really hard there are real barriers to entry to get in there, and it's really hard to get in. And so as a result, we and Fox, in terms of the international companies, the Hollywood studios and all so forth, really have pretty solid footholds there. And the other studios are in some way or another, but nobody's been able to do it on the same kind of scale that either we or Fox has been able to. And I think that's been a real advantage to us, and I think that's what's resulted in our success there, and the reason that it's actually the largest piece of my portfolio, even though it's on the other side of the planet, and not really all that based in American Hollywood content.
So you mentioned the 25 or so channels, but if you would drill down a little bit and describe more of what is Sony Television in India today.
Well, there's about, I think I lose track of it, it's 28, 29. I think we distribute 3 or 4 or 5 for other players. We have a joint venture with BBC called BBC Earth, which broadcasts BBC sort of science content, and we have a partnership with ESPN. We have, but within the whatever it is, 28, 29 channels, 11 of them are sports channels. We started up our own sports channels, and then we acquired a business earlier this year called 10 Sports, which had 9 channels, and so now I think there's 11 sports channels there, and so we're one of 2 major sports channel players there. And then on the entertainment side, I guess what we call the mothership, our anchor ship, is Sony Entertainment Television. It's all Hindi language, primetime, premium content, all created and produced and evolved and developed within the market. And right now, I can say, I'm glad we're doing this today. I could have said it last week, I'll say it this week. We're the #1 channel in the market. I wouldn't have said that to you 4 weeks ago, and I may not say it to you 4 weeks from now, but right now we're #1.
Today we are.
The reason we're #1, anybody who runs a network knows there's nothing like a hit. We're in the middle of broadcasting our run of the 9th season of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which is hosted by Amitabh Bachchan, and it's the #1 show in the market right now, and so as a result, it's the rising tide has lifted us up. So we're in a good place right now in terms of that. Our other general entertainment, but really it's a comedy channel called Saab, is our other sort of big entertainment play there, doing very well. And then we have a series, then we have the #1 Hindi language movie channel. We have Hollywood movie channel. We have AXN there, which is Hollywood series content. We actually have a couple other different sort of smaller or more regional Hindi language channels. And so there's a lot of, there's the big anchor channels, and then a lot of smaller channels that fill out the portfolio, all of which add up to whatever that is, 29 channels.
And you mentioned sports, and you mentioned 10 Sports. Last year, Sony Television made a $370 million investment to acquire 10 Sports. What was the strategy? What was the plan?
Well, to be a major player in a lot of markets, or most markets, you have to be in the sports business, because sports is live programming, which is more and more important today than ever before, because in a DVR world where people are skipping commercials, the only thing that sort of still survives and stands out and garners the biggest ratings is live sports. So we knew that that was important. In India, there's cricket and then there's everything else, and so you had to be in the cricket business, and we got into the cricket broadcasting business about 15 years ago, when we somehow were able to get the rights to the World Cup there, and that became the basis for broadcasting live sports. But we didn't have a sports channel, so we put it on our Hindi language movie channel, because the two religions in India are cricket and Bollywood, and so we already had a Bollywood movie channel, so we blocked out space, and then over time would acquire the rights to certain key premium sports properties and put them on there, and eventually we started and had the broadcast rights for 10 years to the IPL, the Indian Premier Cricket League, which is the sort of the granddaddy of all cricket, and so that became the basis for the sports business. But you want to be in the sports business for two reasons. A lot of reasons. It's live programming. It garners really strong ratings, and it's a very important driver for your distribution of your channels to cable and satellite affiliates, because it's must-have programming, and so it helps you drive the distribution of your whole channel portfolio to do that. But so as we were evolving, so we started our own channel and acquired rights and so forth. When the opportunity, but there were sort of three or four players in the market. There was Star, there was us, there was 10 Sports, which was owned by Z. There was another one called Neo, some smaller players. And we saw it as an opportunity to consolidate. Z was willing to sell. They wanted to get out of the sports business and focus on their entertainment business. We wanted to double down in the sports business, and so it all just kind of came together. And now really we're in a two-horse race in the market. There's Star, and they have about 10 or 11 channels, and there's us. We have about 10 or 11 channels, and they run a whole lot of cricket, and we run a lot of cricket as well, different kinds from different places. But so if you're either going to go to them or to us if you're a sports league and you want to license your content. But it's been a very good acquisition for us so far, and it's working for us well.
So it's now about a year later?
Well, no, really, we closed in March, so it's really more like six months, I guess.
Oh, is it March of this year? March of this year, yeah. Okay. When we finally closed, probably got announced 6 months earlier than that, but I think we actually closed it in March. So are you seeing evidence of progress yet? I mean,
we are. The integration.
Sony branding it is now different.
We rebranded it with Sony. It's the Sony 10 in a lot of the channels. We have integrated it into our operations. We've been acquiring rights and using the scale of it to make good rights deals, and we've had really good performance on it. So that's why I say 6 months in. Acquisitions are hard, and a lot of them don't work. This one's worked out pretty well so far.
Awesome. So most of what we've been talking about is what you'd call broadcasting, satellite networks, cable casting. What's happening in terms of digital rollout of the channels and over the top?
Yeah, so it's kind of what we talk the most about these days in the hallways and think about the most, because it's certainly where the audience has evolved. And I used to say that the U.S. was sort of a really solid precursor to knowing what was going to happen in the international territories, and depending on where you were talking about, maybe you were talking about Europe 5 years later, they would follow suit, or 10 years later in Latin America, or maybe 20 years later in Asia. And while that's all very true, the thing that's changed is the timelines, because this world's moving so fast and everything is compressed. But we do see the trends and the things that are happening in the United States in terms of the platforms and what they're doing and how the audience is using them. So we know that we need to be in that world. We need to evolve our portfolio from just being linear channels to being linear channels and on-demand offerings. We have, in the United States, we have a advertising supported nonlinear platform called Crackle, where we've built a lot of technology and where we have great distribution and are producing a lot of original content, which is then exported around the world. And then Crackle is also in Latin America. So we have, in Latin America, we have linear channels, but we also have an SVOD version of Crackle down there, and looking where else in the world to export the Crackle proposition. But even in other territories, we have more localized digital, over-the-top, TV everywhere, nonlinear, however you want to characterize or package it. But there isn't anything we do right now that doesn't have a traditional element, but also a digital element, because that's what the world wants, and that's what the audience wants.
And in that regard, to what degree is Sony pioneering, and or to what degree are the other major U.S. multinational media players doing comparable things?
I don't know that we're pioneering anything. I just think we're doing it and hoping we're doing it in conjunction with and on the back of the assets that we have. So I think all of my competitors are doing it in some form or another. They're just doing it the same and different because their asset mixes, their channels, their content strategy is probably a little bit different. In India, for example, we have a digital platform called Sony Live. Star has one called Hotstar, and Viacom 18 has a different one. And so everyone's got one now because you have to have one. But everybody's models are a little bit different. Some people charge a little bit differently. I think it's still early days, and I think everybody is experimenting. In Japan, where we have Animax, which is the number one 24/7 Japanese anime channel, we also have just launched, or I guess are launching, something called Animax Plus on the PlayStation platform, which will be really an on-demand version of that. And so in each territory, we're doing it same but different, with ourselves or with other partners, and the thing I'm quite certain of is whatever it all looks like today for us and our competitors will be completely different in 5 years, because it's just evolving and changing so quickly.
And so, going back to more traditional television, when you look at what's on your air around the world, how are decisions being made relative to U.S. or U.S.-driven content versus locally produced content, and the mixes in India but elsewhere in the world?
Pretty much the decisions are made locally in most cases, because with a lot of conversation and collaboration with the home office, just based on their access and proximity to the Hollywood content and their knowledge of it. But at the end of the day, the viewership patterns in every market and every territory are just different from everywhere else. And so we've adopted, I think, a more localized view of that, rather than trying to jam the same programming everywhere, whether it's going to work or not. We've sort of tried to be much more customized in our thinking about it. So what the audience wants to watch in terms of US content, or maybe not US content, in Singapore is going to be a lot different than in Spain, and it's going to be different in Argentina, and so on and so on. And so we try to find the balance between a global business but a locally sensitive and programmed business. And India is an even different and completely locally managed and constructed business, because the Hollywood content aspect, the English language content aspect of it and that market and the viewership patterns is very small compared to Hindi language. And so, they know a little bit better what Hindi language shows are going to work than I do.
Now, if I remember correctly, when Sony, I guess Sony Entertainment Television first came into India, it was predominantly, if not totally, English, and then through trial and error, as you say, you now have all Hindi language plus English language separate. But when you had one channel, you morphed.
Yeah, that's right, because when there was no real TV production business in India at the time. So there wasn't that much programming if you wanted to do it locally. We as a company and we as an industry had to build up that expertise in that industry and move it over from the movie side and so forth over a long period of time. We also had the experience in other parts of the world of taking formats, US formats, and trying to localize them. So, for example, one of the first things we did in terms of localized programming was in Germany, where we did a local version of Who's the Boss, and we did a local version of Married with Children. And you sort of tweak the story. So, you know, Who's the Boss in the US, he was a baseball player. So in Germany, he was a soccer player. You know, and you would do those sorts of things. And they worked to a degree, but what we realized was the stuff that was ultimately going to work better was the real homegrown local stories aspect of it. But you're right, we did try to do that. I think we did a Hindi language version of Bewitched and stuff like that. And it was just, they were bridges to what was ultimately truly local, from the ground up stories. But it was evolutionary, and it took a number of years to get to that point.
And so you mentioned production. All of your channels globally will play some combination of acquired content, and then you put on your, so to speak, your producer's hat and look at projects, fund projects, bring them into production. So talk a bit about Sony Television in the production business locally in different markets. How deeply are you in? What are some examples of the kinds of things you're doing?
So the reason, in the past, the reason you would do local programming was because traditionally localized programming, as I was saying earlier, will rate better. So you might be able to do a local programming and go out to advertisers and get it funded in a better way, and would rate more. But the percentage of what we would do in a lot of these markets, local versus the US product, was very, very small. But what's evolved over time is the absolute need and importance of doing the localized programming, for the reasons I just said, but also because it's gotten very expensive to acquire Hollywood content and acquire all of the rights that we need to deliver both to the cable and satellite operators, but also to the digital platforms. And so the way you get around that and control your own destiny is produce more and more of your own stuff that you completely own and control. And so that's been a real sort of a paradigm shift for us. Not that we're not broadcasting the American program, because we still do an awful lot of that, but the pendulum is swung a lot more towards local programming. And we do it in sort of, I guess, 3 different ways. US formats that travel. So for example, I don't remember exactly, well, right now we're in the middle of season 2 in Asia of Asia's Got Talent. So if you know America's Got Talent, it's just the Asian version of that format that's rating very well and broadcasting all over the region there. Now it's shot in English because our judges are all speaking English, even though one is from Indonesia and one is from Korea and one is American. But all of the talent is Asian from all different countries throughout Asia, and that's what people in that part of the world want to see. We're also doing, I can't remember, maybe it's season 6 of The Amazing Race Asia, which again is based on the Amazing Race format, but it's all throughout Asia with Asian contestants and that sort of thing. In Latin America, we're doing in Mexico and Brazil, and hopefully soon in Colombia. We were going to show a kind of a fun clip, but I think we didn't pull that together. But we're doing Shark Tank down there, so it's literally Shark Tank Mexico, Mexican host, Mexican entrepreneurs, and Mexican, whatever they are, multimillionaires and so forth. And what was interesting about that when we were first thinking about doing it, because Shark Tank had been so successful in the United States, was would it work internationally? Would it work in a place like Mexico? And the initial thought on Mexico is, well, we don't really have that kind of entrepreneurial culture. And that honestly, that was coming from the locals there. And that actually didn't make a lot of sense. I think what we've seen just in the world is there's entrepreneurs everywhere in the world. So we did it anyway. We found fantastic contestants, fantastic entrepreneurs, and that's been very successful. We replicated it in Brazil, a lot of success there. So that's an example of a show that checks all the boxes for us in terms of why you do a local show, and has been very successful. There's also a lot of markets where there's been completely, wholly in-country developed local programming that we've had a lot of good luck with. And then we also try to fill out the portfolio with what we call our global productions, which are much more like US big premium dramas that we can put on our channels around the world that are sort of tailored for our channels around the world, that will work for them and that we have all the rights to and can do all those sorts of things. So for example, we just finished production on a show called Absentia, which we shot in Bulgaria. It was by an Israeli producer-director, starring a woman named Stana Katic, who was a big star on Castle for 8 years. And we picked her because not only she's a big TV star here, but Castle was a show that was broadcast on a number of our channels around the world and performed very well. So we tried to be a little bit sort of strategic about all of that. It came out terrific, and we'll announce very, very soon in the next week or so a big global broadcasting deal on that. So eventually we'll be able to see it here in the United States. But in the meantime, it's been airing on a number of our channels around the world and doing very well. So we're pursuing all sorts of different models and variations on the original production model, but it's just become more and more vital to all of our businesses.
And are there creators, writer, producer, directors in all of these countries who have the ability to come to somebody at Sony in India or Sony in Korea or wherever it is and say, you know, here's my script, I have a great idea, and they get reviewed locally and can eventually wind up on the local Sony channels?
Yeah, again, the models are all a little bit different. The talent pools vary depending on the maturity of the production world and community in each market. You know, India is now such a huge production population that where we used to have to import writers from the US or other territories just to kind of help out or coach or fill in. Now it's a completely self-sufficient level of expertise.
And do they get the green light locally, or the green light comes from Culver City?
In that case of India, it all happens locally.
And in the other markets also, where it's...
It depends. It's probably more driven. It's driven in some ways creatively, but also financially. And a lot of the smaller markets can't fund the kind of productions that we want to do on their own, and so you have to put together sort of patchworks and multiple partnership kind of financings, in which case then the whole greenlight process gets much more complicated.
And kind of tying that back to the earlier question, you know, in the movie business, when a major studio or big independent wants to fund a big expensive picture, they say, well, here's what Europe will be worth, here's what China's worth, here's what this is worth, the US, you know, if we put it all together, it's successful. Does that kind of model now influence what you're doing in television?
Well, that's what happens. So on what I was describing, the global productions like Absentia, that's exactly what we did. We knew what the budget could be, and we ran around market by market in partnership with our sales and licensing group, whose job it is to sell all of the studio's content on a local basis around the world. And we literally went market by market and got projections for it until it all added up to what we needed, with the additional benefit of having enough to fund the production without any numbers against the United States, which then gave us the ability to bring the show to the United States free and clear.
So we will see Absentia in the U.S.?
You will see Absentia in the U.S. There'll be an announcement on that in the next week or two.
Okay, one more question. It's a big one, but look forward 10 or 20 years. What does television look like globally, and what does it look like for Sony?
You know, that question was always a daunting question, and if you'd asked me 10 years ago, the blood would drain from my face in the same sort of way, because I would think to myself, gosh, 10 years from now, how could I possibly imagine what it's going to look like? And then if I look back 10 years and look today, I would have been completely wrong and could not have possibly predicted we'd be living in this world we're living in, where we're watching things on our phones and our tablets and all that sort of stuff. So to now look forward 10 years, I guess the only thing that I would assume or predict would be, and it's sort of thinking about my kids and how they've grown up watching TV or not watching TV and so forth. You know, I think it'll be maybe not 100%, but a predominantly on-demand world. I think linear channels as we know them there will be a lot fewer of them. Still think brands are important. I think there will be some really big familiar brands that we're still living with, but even they'll be as dependent on content that's delivered on a when you want it, as you want it kind of a world. I still think that the importance of live events, live sports, the Oscars, big live events will continue to be important. But I think, listen, I think we could see a world where big sporting events are on-demand platforms. I mean, we're seeing Amazon, we're seeing Facebook and YouTube all sort of dabbling a little bit in the sports world. It's not ridiculous to say, oh, you'll only be able to see the Super Bowl on Facebook. And that sort of thing, and that's happening all around the world. I mean, we were just earlier this year when we were bidding for the renewal of the Indian Premier Cricket League, Facebook was one of the biggest bidders for the digital rights to that idea, and so I think that's going to be a really important evolution of it. And I think everything will be on the table. These big Silicon Valley companies, the FANGs and all that sort of stuff are going to be major players in this world, and they're going to be major disruptors in this world. And so anything that we think today is traditional, I don't think anything will be traditional.
And kind of a part two of that question, which we hadn't talked about, Sony makes televisions, humongous televisions, small screens, and so on. The kind of tentpole big events you were describing, particularly the sporting events, will people be watching this on gigantic televisions in their home besides,
Well, I don't even know that they have to be gigantic. I mean, is 65 inches gigantic or just kind of big and normal for a lot of our homes? But I think that at the end of the day, that experience of sitting across from a big TV to watch to watch the Dodger game tonight, or to watch, big events and so forth, or movies, which is important, is not going to go away. It doesn't mean that you won't still do it to some degree on your phone or on your tablet, but that's not going to go away. The quality of the experience continues to get better. It doesn't mean it's the only place you can get it, but there's still going to be a real. I don't think TVs hanging on your wall in your house is going to go away.
No, I think the communal experience.
I think that's important too. 10,
20, whatever, 5 people watching together, laughing together, rooting for the Dodgers together.
I think that's right, and if you're on the go and you want to watch the game. I was at a wedding on Saturday night, and one of the guys I was with is like this the whole time because he's watching the Yankee game, and that's fine, and you can track it. That's not a great sports viewing experience. It's a solution to a problem or a substitution for it. So I'm not saying you're not going to be able to watch a game at any time on a phone or whatever. But in terms of sports, I don't think that's the best viewing experience.
I was on a flight recently, and there was somebody watching a subtitled foreign film on a telephone this big, which is.
It's not the best experience, but if it's your only choice because you're on the go, it's a great, alternative. It's a great option.
The other similar experience I remember is being on a plane with a tiny screen this big in front of me and watching the perfect wave or the perfect storm, and you see the boat is this big. Oh no, big wave!
There are movies like that you just shouldn't do it. It's not fair. It's not fair to the creators, and it's not a good experience.
Absolutely. So I guess a couple of closing thoughts as I'm watching our clock flash and tick down in front of us. Some closing words on global television, Sony, your space in it.
Well, it's continuing to grow. It's changing, and how people are watching TV, whether it's in the U.S. or outside of the U.S., is evolving and changing. But I think the truism of an on-demand world and the always-on availability of whatever you want, whenever you want it, I think has driven more viewership and more demand for content. And so for studios like ours that are producers of content and figuring and just want to distribute and exploit it however it is, by licensing to someone else or putting it on our own channels or whatever it is, it's just creating more opportunity and more demand. And so I think that's really exciting for all the people that are in that business. But the how and the where and the what and the execution of it is pretty interesting these days. But it keeps us in it.
By the way, speaking of sports, I see the clock is now flashing overtime.
Overtime.
So
we're in overtime.
We've gone into overtime.
All right, so it must be a tie.
Yeah, there you go.